Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17, an IV excerpt. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden. You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Paraphrase of the passage. God told Adam that he could freely eat from the trees in the Garden of Eden, but he must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warned that disobedience would bring death. Detailed meaning. Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17 shows God giving humanity both freedom and responsibility. You are free to eat shows God's generosity. Adam was not placed in a restrictive world, but in a garden full of provision and blessing. Any tree in the garden highlights the abundance God provided. God's command was not mainly about limitation, but about trust and obedience. You must not eat introduces a clear moral boundary. God gave Adam a command that required obedience and faith in God's wisdom. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents the choice to trust God's definition of good and evil rather than deciding right and wrong apart from Him. You will certainly die shows the seriousness of sin. Death here includes physical death, but also spiritual separation from God, the source of life. Spiritual lesson. Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17 teaches that true freedom is found in obeying God, not in rejecting His commands. God lovingly gives boundaries for humanity's good. This passage also prepares the way for understanding sin, judgment, and the need for redemption through God's grace. Genesis 3 verse 1, an IV excerpt. Now the serpent was more crafty. Paraphrase of the verse. The serpent, described as crafty, approached the woman and questioned God's command about eating from the trees in the Garden of Eden. Detailed meaning. Genesis 3 verse 1 introduces the temptation that led to humanity's fall into sin. The serpent comes to Eve not with an obvious attack, but with a question that creates doubt about God's word and goodness. The serpent represents the tempter. In the wider biblical understanding, the serpent is associated with Satan, who opposes God and deceives humanity. More crafty means the serpent was cunning, subtle, and deceptive. The temptation begins with manipulation rather than force. Did God really say shows the strategy of temptation, questioning God's command. The serpent tries to make Eve doubt what God said and whether God's instruction can be trusted. God's command is challenged because the serpent twists the focus from God's generous provision to the one restriction God gave. This makes God's boundaries seem unreasonable. Spiritual lesson. Genesis 3 verse 1 teaches that temptation often begins by causing people to doubt God's word, God's goodness, and God's authority. It reminds believers to be watchful, to know God's truth clearly, and to trust that God's commands are given for our good. Genesis 3 verses 4 to 5, an IV excerpt. You will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman. Paraphrase of the passage. The serpent told Eve that she would not die if she ate the fruit. Instead, he claimed that God knew her eyes would be opened and that she would become like God, knowing good and evil. Detailed meaning. Genesis 3 verses 4 to 5 shows the serpent directly contradicting God's command and warning. In Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17, God had told Adam that eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would bring death. Here, the serpent challenges that truth. You will not certainly die is a direct denial of God's word. The serpent makes sin appear safe and harmless. The serpent questions God's goodness by suggesting that God is withholding something beneficial from Adam and Eve. Your eyes will be opened makes disobedience sound like enlightenment or freedom, but it actually leads to shame, guilt, and separation from God. You will be like God appeals to pride and independence. The temptation is not only about eating fruit, it is about wanting to define good and evil apart from God. Knowing good and evil means seeking moral authority without submission to God. Instead of trusting God's wisdom, humanity is tempted to become its own judge of right and wrong. Spiritual lesson. Genesis 3 verses 4 to 5 teaches that temptation often works by twisting God's truth, minimizing consequences, and making disobedience look desirable. It reminds believers to trust God's word and character, even when temptation suggests that sin will bring freedom or wisdom. True life and wisdom come from obeying God, not from rejecting His authority.